On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Rebecca Westerfield, your moderator for this evening. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Liesl Gerntholtz is the Executive Director of the Women's Rights Division of the Human Rights Watch. Previously, she worked for South African Human Rights Commission and the Commission on Gender Equality, focusing on human rights and democracy in South Africa. Hillary Margolis is a women's rights researcher on Syria at Human Rights Watch. Previously, she focused on women's rights in Africa and Southeast Asia, leading aid programs in the Congo and Chad, and working with women and children in Cambodia, Thailand, and Burma. You can read the full biographies for both speakers in this evening's program. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Gerntholtz and Ms. Margolis for a discussion of women's rights in the Middle East.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for inviting us here tonight. I want to talk very briefly about some of the countries in transition, and then I want to make some remarks about the complexity of sort of discussing women's rights in the Middle East. But before I start, I want to talk about how Human Rights Watch works, because I think it's important to understand what we do, because the way that we work and the information we collect is going to frame some of my comments. Human Rights Watch is primarily a documenting organization. We go out into the field and we document human rights violations. In the case of the Women's Rights Division, we're looking primarily at human rights violations against women, violations that are committed against women because they are women, or violations that may have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. But we are primarily interested in talking to victims of human rights violations. That's the source of our information, and it's what we use to do advocacy. It's how we use that information that we get from victims to press governments to make change. So we're not per se a democracy organization, we're not a development organization, we're not an aid organization. So my comments tonight are framed in that context. The Arab Spring initially, I think, offered great promise to women. There are some very moving images in the public sphere around women on Tahrir Square, women on Change Square in Yemen, women in Libya standing shoulder to shoulder with men advocating for change. And I think initially there was much hope, certainly on the part of the West, that the Arab Spring was going to bring sweeping and significant changes to women. The current picture is much more nuanced, and it is perhaps a mixed bag. And I want to talk about three specific situations that we've been working in. I'm not going to talk about Syria because I'm going to leave perhaps the most complex and difficult one for Hillary to talk about. Egypt is perhaps the most obvious example of where the revolution did not immediately bring much change for women, and in fact created a real concern that there'd be a rollback of rights. Egypt was considered to be relatively progressive with regard to women's rights, although it was very clear that Mubarak had leveraged women's rights to advance his own political agenda, that much of what had been done, particularly to advance women's political participation, so the introduction of quotas in Parliament, was really done to increase his influence within Parliament and was not genuinely an empowerment of women initiative. The elections bringing the Muslim Brotherhood into power saw the increase in rhetoric around, for example, setting aside the ban on female genital mutilation, setting aside the minimum age of marriage. It certainly saw a reversal of the gains that women had made in Parliament. We went from 17 women in Parliament prior to the revolution to only 2 in the elections. But what we also saw was that much of the rhetoric did not translate into action. So the laws around the banning of FGM, the laws around a minimum age of marriage actually remained intact. But we also saw a shrinking of space in Egypt where we were able to talk about women's rights, the space that women's human rights defenders had alongside other human rights defenders to advocate for freedoms for women And certainly we didn't see much progress made. Many people will be familiar with a lot of the press work, our own work on sexual harassment of women in public spaces, a huge problem, but one that pre-existed the revolution. So it's really, I think, important to note that what we saw in Tahrir Square was not very different from the realities of women's lives prior to the revolution. My colleagues, I think, those who are working in Egypt on the ground would argue that perhaps the change in government, interestingly enough, offers again the hope of more space for women's rights. We have seen the introduction of a bill to criminalize various forms of domestic violence, and we have seen some willingness on the part of the military government to engage in a discussion about women's rights. So a complex and nuanced picture in Egypt around women's rights. Yemen is particularly interesting to us. The first work that we had done on Yemen on women's rights was a report on early marriage. Those of you who follow Yemen will probably be familiar with the case that has been in the media over the last few days of an 11-year-old girl who died subsequent to marriage and injury she sustained during sex. But we did work in Yemen in 2010 looking at early marriage. And at that stage, there was some hope that the current parliament would set a minimum age of marriage, because there is no minimum age of marriage in Yemen. Girls may be married at any age, and the only limited protection they have is that sex should be banned until they reach puberty. The work that we did there was interrupted by the revolution. We were unable to do any advocacy, and again, we saw women participating actively in the public sphere. Women were part of the leadership of the revolution. We saw Taqwa al-Kaman receiving the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts in Yemen. So we have certainly seen the raising of the profile both of women activists and also of issues around women's rights. The national dialogue, which is the process in Yemen in terms of which a set of constitutional principles are being discussed and agreed upon, has also been very interesting for some of the elements around women's rights that have been introduced and are currently being debated. The current set of proposals, and I should emphasize that these are proposals that have been made during this process, so we don't know the extent to which these will actually be adopted and will inform the drafting of the new constitution. But as they stand currently, they include provisions that provide full equality for women. That's quite different to what we saw in Egypt and Tunisia, where the equality provisions really talked about women as complementing men, talked about a much lesser standard than the full equality required by international human rights laws. But so the national dialogue provisions contain equality for women. They criminalize violence against women. They propose to set aside the reduced penalties for so-called honor killings. And they also propose to look at some of the personal status laws in terms of which women don't have equal rights in marriage, divorce, inheritance, and child custody. So in many respects, a fairly progressive set of proposals, which, if they are included ultimately in a constitution and translated into national laws, will go a very long way to bringing women full equality, at least in terms of the law, if not in practice. We have also seen in Yemen the emergence of a fragile but very vocal women's rights movement. And it is a movement that appears to cross party lines. So you have the coming together of women from different parties to negotiate together as a group around some of these provisions, which I think is a very interesting development. And it's a development that in other transitional countries, including my own country in South Africa, has been one of the most effective ways for women to make gains in terms of sort of constitutional and national law reform processes. And then finally, I want to talk about Libya. Libya also is interesting because you have the emergence again of a women's movement, a movement that is, interestingly to me, largely led by younger women. So you have a set of younger women who have been very effective in lobbying first the National Transitional Council and now the General National Council to really include provisions in the electoral law, which saw the use of a limited quota. that saw about just under 17% of women elected to the parliament being women. You saw some attempts to criminalize various forms of violence that have not yet borne fruit, but you have seen the introduction of sort of a public awareness raising exercise called Purple Hijab Day. And you have seen what to me I think is a very provocative and challenging initiative, which is called the Noor campaign, that is looking at interpreting the Quran in a way to affirm and support women's equality. And this is really in a movement, as I said, that is being led by younger women. And there's, I think, some tension and contestation in Libya around sort of how older women and younger women are navigating sort of a movement towards women's equality. You've also seen some steps in Libya to introducing progressive laws. There is a bill on the table currently which is looking to provide compensation for victims of sexual violence during the Libyan conflict. For me, this is a very critical development because sexual violence in Libya is highly stigmatized. Currently, there is no law that criminalizes sexual violence at all. There has been the use of what they call social rehabilitation centers during Gaddafi's time, which is where women who had been raped, women who were victims of domestic violence, women who had left conventional and traditional relationships have been taken out of society to be socially rehabilitated. So this law is very progressive in a number of ways. Firstly, it recognizes the stigma that sexual violence survivors suffer, and it attempts to take steps to address that. It also recognizes that men were victims, and at Human Rights Watch, much of the work that we did documented the use of sexual violence in detention against men as a pattern of sexualized torture. So it recognizes, although the law deals primarily with women, it includes a recognition that men were victims and that they can benefit from some of the provisions in the Act. It recognizes children born out of rape. I think it makes it somewhat unique globally in that it recognizes, firstly, that pregnancy is a consequence of rape and that children who are born of rape need to have their rights protected. So it contains a number of provisions that recognize the rights of children and that seek to protect children both in the context of those who stay with their biological mothers and those that are placed into institutionalized care. So a very interesting piece of legislation, one that has been a long time coming, because one of the first things that the Transitional Council did at the end of the revolution was to pass a law that compensated, firstly, the families of men and women who were killed during the revolution, and then that also sought to compensate people who were injured. And victims of sexual violence were explicitly not recognized in that law. So this law coming 2 years down the line is an interesting attempt to rectify that in a way that I think is largely progressive. It recognizes the right of confidentiality. It recognizes the need to provide women who come forward with protection, recognizing that some of them may well be at risk of honor killing, of ostracization, of rejection and abandonment from their families and communities. And it recognizes that women and men victims of sexual violence require a range of services, including health care and psychosocial care. So, in this context of a fairly traditional and not necessarily a progressive context around other women's rights, we are seeing sort of a recognition of sexual violence as a human rights violation, not as a crime against honor, but as something that is a human rights violation in which victims need to be treated with dignity and respect. So I think, what I hope I've illustrated with my remarks is that it is a much more complex picture than we often see, particularly in Western media, that there have been some very positive steps that have been taken to protect women's rights, but that certainly these gains are fragile, they remain at risk, and that the kinds of institutions that we would look and that we would hope would protect these rights, like a strong and vibrant civil society, are not yet fully in place. So, I think what we hope and what we are looking at is working to continue to document violations, but also working to strengthen some of these institutions that we hope will support democracy and democratic values in these countries.
Thank you. Hillary?
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for having us this evening. As Liesl noted, our methodology relies primarily on direct testimony, firsthand accounts of experiences people have had with a variety of abuses. And so my comments as well will be very much informed by the field work I've been doing, which has been in Jordan and Lebanon, interviewing Syrian refugees and service providers and humanitarian agencies. I think that something that people forget when talking about the refugee situation that's come out of Syria is that it's in some ways quite different than the typical refugee setting, at least than what we're used to thinking of in terms of refugee situations. So we have a situation now where, as many people know, they have over 2 million refugees now. That, of course, is only the refugees who are actually registered. So we know that the number is actually considerably higher, most likely. And again, this is also only in the surrounding countries. So Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and some in the North Africa and Egypt. So that doesn't include people who've gone to other countries as well. In Jordan alone, there are over 500,000 refugees now. The major camp there, called Zatri, is the 4th largest city now in Jordan. In Lebanon, we're looking at over 720,000 refugees. It's about a fifth of the population of the country now. So this is obviously massive, massive influx, and has severe consequences not only for the refugee population, but for the host population as well. What makes this different in part than what we're used to thinking of as a refugee setting is that the majority are what we would call urban refugees, which is actually a misnomer. Many of them are actually rural or peri-urban, but that is to say they're not living in camps. Jordan has a massive refugee camp, Zatri, which is now over 100,000 people. It's the 2nd largest camp in the world after Dadaab in Kenya. And it's growing every day. They're actually building a 2nd camp to house new arrivals there. It was meant to house about 40,000. It's now over 100,000. And yet, about 70% of refugees in Jordan are actually living outside of the camp. So the media tends to focus on Zatri and the problems in Zatri, but actually most refugees are not in the camp. In Lebanon, by contrast, there are no camps at all. The government is quite adamant due to what they see as the Palestinian situation that has evolved over time in Lebanon. They're quite adamant about not allowing any form of camp in the country for fear of creating essentially a second Palestinian crisis in Lebanon. So there we have 720,000 refugees living throughout the country, scattered in a variety of places with very little in the way of protection mechanisms, very little in the way of shelter provision. So it's really quite a different context, and of course creates a whole host of particular issues that accompany that in terms of protection. The Women's Rights Division is interested in examining the effect of the Syrian conflict on women and girls from a whole variety of perspectives. So that includes everything from the use of sexual violence in the conflict, which is what tends to get the most attention, to protection risks in refugee settings. And protection risks in refugee settings can range from, again, sexual violence or exploitation, but also to things that might seem mundane, like access to medical care or access to services and resources in general. So my work has focused on examining this whole range of what we would see as abuses and potential violations, and trying in some way to ascertain how much they're happening, what the key issues are, and what the major concerns are for women and girls coming out of the Syrian conflict today. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the refugee situation and what we're seeing on the ground as the really the primary concerns. As I mentioned, one of the issues we're looking at is access to services and resources, and this is a major problem. The majority of refugees are women and children, as is typical in any refugee setting. Access to resources is limited, partly because of lack of funding. As I'm sure you've heard, the UN appeal is less than 50% funded for the Syrian crisis. I was just in Lebanon. I just returned a few days ago, and one of the major developments there, one of the major very unfortunate developments, is that the UNHCR is actually having to cut its assistance to refugees. So beginning within the next month or so, only 70% of the refugees who were receiving assistance will continue to do so. The other 30% who are deemed the least vulnerable, of what is, of course, an extremely vulnerable group to begin with, will no longer receive any assistance. This is because they simply don't have the funds to continue giving assistance to everyone that they've been helping. So this is obviously a huge problem. It also creates even more vulnerability among the refugee population. In addition to this kind of cutting, which we've also seen with medical care, they've already cut coverage of medical care from 100% to 75% in Lebanon. That 25%, which might be $10, $15, is enough to keep people from getting medical care. In addition to that, there simply aren't enough services, particularly in the urban areas. So in the camp population, it's one thing. It's hard enough to provide targeted services for such a massive population, but when you get outside the camp, you're trying to reach people in a whole variety of communities, particularly in Lebanon again. There are issues with crossing sectarian lines. People in a Sunni community will not go to a facility in a Shiite community, partly for fear. For security reasons. So you have sectarian issues, you have transportation issues. The cost of transport to get to services is prohibitive. For women in particular, women, they're the caretakers. They often have 4, 5, 6 children. To bring 6 children to get some kind of service, forget it. That also means paying for transportation for 6 or 7 people. So there are all kinds of barriers that are happening that are preventing people from accessing services even where they are available. So that is one of the issues that we're seeing. Another is reduced mobility for women and girls. This is particularly problematic for women and girls. And this is actually true within Syria as well as externally. We are seeing that partly out of fear, movement of women and girls is being severely restricted. So this is both self-imposed, women saying that they don't feel safe going out, but it's also imposed usually by male family members, fathers or husbands, who are not allowing women and girls to go out because they're afraid of harassment, they're afraid of sexual violence or sexual assault, they're afraid, a lot of people in Lebanon are afraid of kidnapping. There have been kidnappings recently in the news. Simply also being in a strange place. So there's a whole variety of reasons, but women's mobility is severely curtailed. We actually spoke to one woman in my recent visit to Lebanon whose husband virtually will not let her out of their room. She lives in a collective shelter in North Lebanon and hardly ever goes out because he just won't allow it. And this is not uncommon. So, and within Syria as well, restricted mobility because of insecurity, but also in some areas, and actually we've recently had reports of this happening in rebel-held areas, of greater restrictions on women's mobility, the imposition of what are so-called morality laws around women's behavior, their dress, their ability to go out of the home. And so we are also seeing it within Syria due to insecurity and violence, but also for other reasons. So this is also a major concern. And of course, that also impacts women's ability to access resources and services. When they can't leave the house, they really can't get to anything. In addition, the risk for exploitation is enormous. In both Jordan and Lebanon, this is really a huge concern at this point. For somewhat differing reasons, some the same and some different. In Jordan, women and girls are, well, all refugees actually, who live inside the camp are part of, in order to exit the camp, they're part of what's called a bailout system. They have to have someone on the outside of the camp vouch for them to allow them to live legally or officially outside of the camp. Of course, people don't always have someone to vouch for them, and people are quite desperate to get out of the camp, thinking that the conditions out of the camp will be better. They're usually not, but people think they will be. So this, of course, has led to quite a bit of smuggling. Exploitation. Someone will come up to them and say, hey, pay us this much and we'll get you out. People promising things like marriage or employment in order to get someone to take them out of the camp, etc. And then once out, of course, they're living there unofficially with no documentation. So this is one risk for exploitation that's kind of specific to Lebanon, to Jordan, pardon me. But in general, also, if they are working at all, women and girls are tending to work in what we would consider very private spaces. So they would be working more often in a private home doing cleaning. They might be working in a private shop, a small store, or doing small menial tasks for someone at home. And so they really have no protection from sexual assault and abuse. And that is something that is being reported quite often. We spoke to one woman in Lebanon, a young woman who had left 3 jobs already because of attempted sexual assaults and attempted exploitation. And at this point, she was too afraid to try to get another job, but her family was pressuring her because they said, we need the income, we need you to work. And she was absolutely petrified of trying to work again. We've also talked to women who have been working in private homes doing cleaning, where the male homeowner has approached them for sexual relationships and things like that. So this is also a serious problem. Exploitation is also a risk with service provision. We were particularly hearing about that with relation to local faith-based service providers in Lebanon. There's a lot of concern because they're unregulated by the government. They tend not to be part of the UN or any other kind of broader mechanism that's offering assistance. And so they're really not facing regulations or any kind of sanctions for misbehavior, and we had several reports of abuse and attempted exploitation by them as well. Another issue that's coming up a lot, and this is actually getting quite a lot of media attention, is what we would call negative coping mechanisms. So this is ways that a family or an individual might react when they're faced with a situation of increasing desperation. At this point, we really have a crisis where refugees are receiving less and less assistance and becoming more and more desperate and more dependent. And one of the things that's been raised quite frequently is the possibility that refugees are succumbing to some of these negative coping mechanisms, including child marriage or forced marriage, which people would say can happen because a family may not have enough money to feed all of their children. They may see it as a release of a burden, also for money, financially, and also as a protection mechanism. Some families view this as a way to protect their girls from from alleged sexual violence or other kinds of assault. They feel that they'll be safer once married. This is something that is getting a lot of attention. I think that it's very important to contextualize it. We do know that early marriage was actually quite common in some parts of Syria prior to the conflict. We don't have baseline data, so it's very hard to ascertain how much it's increasing or how it's changing, other than through anecdotal reporting. We also know that marriage to people from outside of Syria was also not uncommon. Particularly in Jordan, there are very close ties between southern Syria and northern Jordan. There's been intermarriage there for many, many years. And even one of the phenomenon that's been widely reported and criticized is this idea of men from the Gulf going over to marry and find Syrian brides. Again, unfortunately, it was not uncommon even prior to the conflict. This is definitely something that's been happening for years. The question for us is, has it changed? Is it happening for different reasons? Is it happening in a different way or in different circumstances? Is it happening because people feel desperate and feel that they need to do this because they have limited options? At this point, we really actually don't have very good information about that. Most of the families that I spoke with and interviewed, particularly, this was something I looked into particularly in Jordan when I was there in June, and found that actually most families were incredibly resistant to this. They did admit that they were in very precarious situations and that they were certainly getting proposals for their daughters or themselves, but that they were going to do everything they could to avoid this. They did not feel that this was particularly an option. So, my findings thus far would be that actually it's not happening to the extent that it's being reported in the media. But again, we don't have a good baseline, and this is anecdotal at this point. So it is certainly an issue that continues to be raised and that people are extremely concerned about. And the risk is absolutely there. The attempts by some people to exploit the situation in this way, it's definitely happening. So the question is sort of at what point may people start, if they're not doing it already, may they start to do it as a way of coping with the situation. The same goes for survival sex or sex work, another phenomenon that's being widely reported. During my recent trip to Lebanon, I would say that all indications are that it is certainly happening there. We had very strong indications, particularly in one area of Lebanon, that this was a problem where Syrian women are engaging in prostitution, essentially, and sex work for money because they're pretty desperate. As I said, in Lebanon in particular, it's this urban refugee situation. Most of the refugees don't have housing provided for them. They're paying rent, usually between $100 and $200 a month for very small, shabby dwellings. And this, of course, is an enormous sum. I mean, most of them are not working. They're actually not allowed to work in most jobs in Lebanon or Jordan. And what's more, the governments have now prohibited any of the international organizations from leading income-generating activities or any kind of job skills activities or training. So, this is definitely a situation that's sort of, becoming more and more desperate as time goes on. Another issue that is coming up, and again, very typical of refugee settings, is an increase in interpersonal violence or domestic violence. This is something that, unfortunately, we would actually expect to see in this context, where you have, a very large population living in very close quarters with very little employment, very little opportunity, and increasing desperation, depression, frustration, etc. So this is definitely something that is being reported. Reports are increasing, but again, we actually don't have a good baseline for what was happening prior to the conflict. So most of the assumption that this is increasing, again, is based primarily on anecdotal reporting. Also, the fact that reporting is increasing doesn't necessarily mean that the rate is increasing. It means that people are coming forward more. So it's a bit hard to tell just yet what the trend is, but certainly it's being reported quite a bit in the contexts. One other issue I wanted to bring up, which is actually more internal to Syria, is the issue of female activists. And, women are playing a really critical role in the conflict in Syria. It hasn't often been recognized, but women have really been activists. They've been protesters. They also actually have been on the front lines in some cases, and really supporting certain groups. And they have been targeted because of this. So we spoke to many women who'd been detained because of their own activism. We also spoke to women who were detained or abused because of the alleged opposition support of their family members. So during home raids or home searches, oftentimes the men will flee for fear of being detained or being abused, leaving the women and children at home. And certainly in cases where the regime forces believe that that male family members are in line with the opposition, this could certainly result in abuse, harassment, et cetera, for the women who are sort of left behind. So this was definitely a risk that we identified amongst women in Syria. Also for nurses and medics working in pro-opposition clinics, also being targeted, and a serious issue. In detention, of course, they're experiencing, just like men, torture, sometimes sexual violence, not always, but sometimes, and physical abuse. The other issue that I think is key to remember, and especially in the refugee setting, is that these women and girls, if they do face these issues, if they do, for example, face harassment or sexual assault, they really have very little in terms of any kind of system of redress or complaint. They simply, they can't go to the police or the local authorities. They won't be helped. In many cases, they're actually afraid that they'll be harmed or they'll be detained. This is especially true as we're starting to see more and more problems with documentation, lack of documentation. People who are coming in over unofficial borders, which is often because they have someone in their family who's wanted by the Syrian regime. They feel that they can't cross the official border for safety reasons. They come in over the unofficial border. They have no documentation. Or, as I said earlier, they get smuggled out of the camp in Jordan. They're living unofficially outside of the camp. They don't have documentation. Another major problem we're starting to see in Lebanon is that after about a year's time, to live there officially, there's a fee to renew a residence permit of $200 per person that the government is unwilling to waive. And, so of course we have more and more people living there illegally and unofficially because they simply cannot even begin to afford this fee. And once people are living without documentation, they have even less system for redress. They have less ability to access resources, medical care, distribution of aid. They also have, even more fear and less mobility. They're very, very afraid of moving around. They're very afraid of going to any kind of authority figure for anything, let alone to complain about something like sexual assault. So I think it's also very important to remember that amongst this vulnerable population, the system that's in place for protection, any kind of mechanism to help them protect themselves is essentially absent. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. Liesl, let me ask you, you once wrote that violence against women won't stop until men stop perpetuating it. Where are the men in this discussion? Can you identify male leadership or male-led initiative who are moving towards gender equality in the Middle East?
Yes and no. I think one of the interesting things for me, for example, has been in Yemen, where the minimum age of marriage campaign is being spearheaded partly by a male member of parliament. And what is interesting to me about that is that the refusal by the government to set a minimum age of marriage prior to the revolution was that it is un-Islamic. He is a religious cleric. So I think that there is slowly, in some cases, sort of an emerging voice, a male voice. We've seen that in Egypt, where you have younger men who have been very much part of the movement to stop sexual violence in public spaces during the protests, who have been part of a movement to rescue women who are at risk. So I think, as is the case all over the world, I think there is sort of an emerging male voice about it. It is perhaps more difficult in the Middle East for that voice to come through, but I think it's certainly there in some spaces.
Hillary, are you seeing that in the Syrian refugee issue?
I would address that more in terms of actually the the conflict itself. As I said, we definitely are seeing women's voices in the conflict, in activism, certainly, particularly in the opposition. The problem comes when we come to leadership. And when it comes time to sit at the table and negotiate, that's where women's voices are really missing, and there really hasn't been a lot of allowance for women to participate in that level of the discussion.
Well, let's ask you this. In your work for gender equality, how do you approach local, cultural, and religious barriers to full gender equality?
I think the one thing that we have learned, because I think it's important to recognize that these are challenges that happen all over the world. So these are not challenges that are limited to the Middle East. We see this in the work that we do in Africa, in Latin America. So one thing I think that I have taken has been that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. That you really have to look at particular context, you have to look at a given situation, you have to see what is going to work. And I say that bearing in mind that what we're trying to do is we're trying to use the information that we collect from the ground, as Hillary has just described. And we're trying to use that, and we're trying to put that in front of the people who can use that information to make change. So we're trying to really assess who has power and influence, how do you get that information to them, and how do you put that information to them in a way that is going to be persuasive and compelling to them. Sometimes what we have done, for example, in a report that we did on female genital mutilation in Iraq, is we did try to engage in a discussion about how the Quran interprets FGM. We looked at some progressive jurisprudence from Egypt, and we included that in the report because we thought we needed to engage local religious leaders, and we thought that would be compelling. But that's not always a strategy that is effective all over the place because, a pushback for us in trying to do that is that, we are seen often as a Western organization, and for many people, we would have no business interpreting the Quran. So we really tried to be strategic in looking at sort of what is the information that we need to put in front of people, how do we package that in a way that it is going to be persuasive and compelling, and how do we package that given who we are and what we do. So I think that we really are opportunistic, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and sometimes strategies that work in one context don't work in other in different contexts.
Hillary, would you like to add to that?
I would simply agree, with what Liesl has said. I think that one of the keys is finding local allies that you can work with, as Liesl said, so that we're not simply sort of the Western organization or person coming in and telling people what to do, but finding people on the ground from the community who actually are already trying to spearhead change, and then working with them and trying to reinforce their efforts in the best ways that we can.
Okay. And you talked earlier about legislative action to advance gender equality and how fragile that's been. Is that because the legislatures are ahead of the public consensus on these issues, or is the legislation being driven by public consensus? And then secondly, how do we know that? Are there polls you can point to, or what's informing that?
It's been different in all three of the countries. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the national dialogue in Yemen, I think for me, is probably one that is relatively closely matching sort of at least the urban population in Yemen, which is quite small. I mean, there has been an attempt to make it inclusive. There has been an attempt, however limited, to really reach out and engage sections of the population. And as I've said, there is a fragile women's movement that is participating very actively and across party lines in this process. In other places, that's not necessarily true. So we know that the process that led to the drafting of the Egyptian constitution was extremely was really disempowered whole sections of civil society, not just women's human rights defenders, but a whole range of sectors were excluded. It was drafted very quickly, whereas the process in Yemen, the national dialogue, has stretched over a period of a year. I think they drafted the constitution in Egypt over a period of 60 days. So I think it's been different in every country. So I think that question is sort of hard to answer, to say whether, overall, the proposals that are emerging from these processes are representative of public opinion. Libya, I think the process has been semi-inclusive. So I think it is a very mixed bag, again, a very mixed picture again.
Are there any other countries, such as Tunisia, for instance, who are advancing more in the area of gender equality?
Well, Tunisia was probably one of the most progressive countries in the Arab world, if not the most progressive country. So they started at a very different place. They had a much better, more well-developed civil society, including an active women's movement. I think the concern about Tunisia is that we have seen certainly a closing of democratic space. We have seen some targeting of civil society activists. So I think what looked initially as perhaps the most positive picture in the early stages of the Arab Spring is now looking very different, and I think there are real concerns. Again, at this point, the gains both that happened before and during the resolution for women remain intact. So we haven't seen a rollback of rights in Tunisia, but we have seen some very worrying signs.
I was intrigued by your comment about intergenerational differences in terms of the way women are addressing issues of gender equality. I wonder if you'd like to talk about that a bit more.
I mean, for me, that was very explicit and very obvious in Libya. That you saw a generation, and this is counterintuitive for me because you see younger women's rights activists, often in their 20s, who are really embracing Islam, for whom the idea that Sharia will inform the constitution, national laws, is not negotiable. It's not necessary to be discussed. It's what they want. It's interesting that if you look at how they dress, most of the younger women veil their hair, whereas older women don't. But what they are interested in doing, and what I think is very interesting, is that they really are wanting to use the Quran and progressive and what I guess you would call feminist interpretations of the Quran to underpin their activism for women's equality. And they've done that relatively successfully so far. I mean, it's really early days. But they have had this purple hijab campaign, for example, there are huge billboards in Tripoli and Zawiya and some of the urban areas like Benghazi that have verses of the Quran that talk about violence against women being unacceptable, being un-Islamic. So it's very interesting, but there is clearly a very profound discomfort amongst older women. And again, the women's movement in Libya is really very fragile. I mean, you had a country where for 42 years there was no real civil society. But you have sort of a group of fairly well-educated women, and you have a group of women who are returning, having been in exile. And for them, there's a huge discomfort, both sort of in younger women assuming these leadership roles, but also in the strategies and tactics of the movement. So for them, they're really looking at using international human rights law. They are looking at very different sort of strategies to promote women's equality. And there's a real sort of disconnect and uneasiness between the two parts of the movement. They've worked together on some issues, but at this point they're quite separate on other issues. And many of the older activists have not supported this campaign to use Islam to promote women's equality and to promote an anti-violence against women campaign.
Do you have any views on this impact of perhaps going one step backwards to go two steps forward?
I take my own experience in South Africa where, during the struggle against apartheid, women played a prominent role in the anti-apartheid movement, whether it was in exile as part of the ANC or part of the movement within the country. And there was a very explicit demand made by the ANC that women would not pursue an equality agenda until the struggle for racial equality was complete. And I think that we are now, really almost 25 years after the end of apartheid, beginning to feel the effects of that decision. And so I think I think a pragmatic view would be that you take your successes and you take your gains where you can find them. But I think in South Africa, while we have been able to put in place a very strong legal framework around gender equality, we have really good laws. I think the fact that they are not implemented, I mean, there's problems across the board with implementation, but I think around women's rights, there are problems beyond just a lack of resources and a lack of skills. I think that relate to a lack of respect for equality for women that has its roots in this decision that racial equality was more important and was a more worthy goal than gender equality. So I think that I am coming to the conclusion, I think, that you have to pursue an equality agenda for women really in a principled way, because I think you lose out. So I think I'm less of a pragmatist as I get older, not more.
What about you, Hillary? What's your thought on that?
I think that, when it comes to Syria, I think it's becoming a situation where there's a lot of concern that it's going to fall into the same trap as Tunisia, for example. In a lot of ways, Syria was actually quite progressive for women's rights ahead of the conflict, particularly in urban areas. And it would appear that it's taking a step back already during the conflict. I mean, clearly things aren't over there, despite all the discussion about intervention. But it would appear that there is a conservatism that is really recurring. As I mentioned, in rebel-held areas as well. This is not just in areas controlled by the regime. And there are certain restrictions that seem to be being placed on women and girls that were not there previously. And I think that, there's a great bit of concern about if that continues or gets worse, how do you regain what you've lost? And particularly if women are not included at some kind of high level in any kind of peace process, in any kind of government moving forward, in new policy development, which appears to be the trend at this point. I mean, there are groups fighting that, but I think that there's a very serious risk of losing some of the ground that had been gained, and then I think getting that back will take years and years.
Well, what about the situation on the ground in the refugee camps, for instance, in whatever informal self-governance that's going on? Are women playing any role in that?
Generally minimal. It tends to be dominated by men, as unfortunately has been the case in every refugee setting I've been in. I will say, however, that I think the Syrian refugee issue is at such a crisis point that that's simply not the priority. The priority is shelter. It's feeding their families, particularly for women. And I think that's entirely understandable in the situation. So although I would say that the organic leadership doesn't seem to be going in the direction of including women or really supporting women, I think there are a variety of reasons for that. And at this point, their focus, frankly, is just on surviving, really.
And are there any groups of women who are organizing behind, let's say, the upfront leadership around some issues, or do you see much of that?
In the refugee setting,
Yes.
or in
Yes, in the refugee. Both.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, around the conflict itself, absolutely. There's no question. There are some very strong activist groups, very strong individual activists as well, who are working quite a bit to promote sort of the women's rights agenda and also just to sort of put a face to the women's involvement in the conflict and in the context there. In the refugee settings, some, I haven't seen as much of it at this point. Certainly there are women who are, I would say mostly women who are acting as some form of service provider, so often as medical personnel or a social worker who in their own way, I don't think that they would even necessarily consider it activism, but in their own way they are galvanizing support, they are getting women to reach out to other women in the camp or in the community. And so I think that there is some of that that's starting, but at a pretty basic level at this point.
So there are a lot of very concerned folks here who want to be supportive, who want to be involved in some way of supporting this effort. What are some of the best channels for that activity?
That's a very good question and a very hard one to answer, unfortunately. Clearly there are a lot of groups operating on the ground who need funds desperately. A lot of organizations, as I said, the UN appeal is greatly underfunded, as are most of the international and local NGOs working on the ground. I think in addition, the human rights organizations, the activist organizations also are in great need of support. I can't really name one particular, group, partly because I don't want to be biased, but also just I think it's everyone is doing their own part. All of these organizations, all of these groups are doing their own part to really try to make a difference. So I think supporting them is trying to stay aware of what the nuances are of the conflict, not get wrapped up in some of the media focus on some of the issues that may or may not actually be really the key aspects of what's happening.
Like what kind of issues?
I think that at times there's a tendency to sensationalize some of the issues, particularly around women and girls. I think the issue of sexual violence in conflict has become quite well known. It's become, very well documented in some cases. It's also something that I think people believes will sell newspapers and sell magazines. And we have to be very careful around that issue. People worked very hard and for a very long time to get the idea of sexual violence and conflict into the conversation. And it is something that is extremely important to examine. At the same time, it's just as important not to make it seem like it's worse than it is, or not to make it seem like it's happening where it's not. I just think that sometimes when you dig a bit deeper into some of the headlines or the stories, the evidence is simply not there. Not to say it's not happening, but it has not yet been shown, been verified.
Well, there's some very daunting tasks, right, before the international human rights community in ensuring gender equality in this part of the world. Let's end this on a positive note, though. Tell us where, each of you, please tell us where the hope is.
You start.
For me, the hope is in the fact that in all these places, including in Syria, you have fragile but active groups of women who are organizing at a political level, at a level of providing services to their community, and that these women are actively engaged in discussing what they want these new countries and also what they would like to see in Syria. So for me, what gives me hope is the role that women continue to play, because I think what is going to make a difference is having a strong, vibrant civil society that women can participate fully in. And there are many signs in all of these countries that give me hope that, in fact, that is slowly emerging. And I do think that once, it's like the genie, once it's out of the bottle, it's very hard to put it back in. So for me, that's where I find the hope. I find the hope in the women's groups, in the women's activists, in the voices of women that won't be silenced.
Thank you. And Hillary, I'm sorry, we don't have time for your response, but I'm sure people would like to hear it afterwards as they can come up and ask you. That concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Ms. Liesl Gerntholtz and Ms. Hillary Margolis for this very excellent and provocative discussion, I think. And thank you very much, the audience, for being here this evening.